Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I am your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Maria Brandell, who is currently an intern at New Polity, which is a Catholic think tank in the pleasant town, I assume pleasant town, of Steubenville, Ohio. She's been on my channel 3 times now, including this one, and over the course of these conversations, we've spoken about her Catholic faith and its interaction with politics, the inner life, and the outer life in general. In this conversation, we further our discussion along those lines and get more into the spiritual aspects of her religious faith and Catholic faith and faith in general. She is such a wonderful guest to have on, and I know that if you've seen her before, you'll be excited to see her again. Without further ado, here is Maria Brandell.
Sweet. How are you doing?
I'm okay. How's
you seem
it?
a little tired.
No, it's the last day of the fast. I was actually kind of cold.
Oh, yeah. How's that going? That sounds really intense.
What's your fasting journey? What have you tried? So I can give you context.
Nothing nearly as intense as Ramadan.
A day? 3 days?
What?
A weekend?
I like a full fast. I've gone a full day fasting from food on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So I've done it on occasion. I tried to do that more regularly this past Lent, and I could not at all. I couldn't function at work.
Really? Yeah.
I just couldn't think. I get very distracted when I don't have food. And if
you work in education, correct?
Well, I was teaching, but it's more of an internship position at New Polity, so it involves like writing and research on occasion. Right now, since we're preparing for a conference, it's been a lot of emails, which is my least favorite thing to do.
Really? You don't like the tap of your clicky keyboard?
No.
No? Okay, that's fine.
Well, the problem is that I think too much. It should just be an email, Benjamin. I should just send an email, but I read it 3 times.
Oh, okay, and then you compose it in iambic pentameter before you send it off or something.
I send people poems in response.
You should.
They don't know this, but if they write into New Polity, you'd have to request for one. And then
I wish I could make it to that conference. I'm going to be in Ireland and coming back that day.
No way.
I don't know how to change my flight to land in Pittsburgh instead of Seattle.
That'd be convenient. What brings you to Ireland?
A organization is hosting me. It's called GenSpect. They are working on reformulating gender healthcare and kind of wresting it from the talons of the ideologically possessed, and providing actual care and research-based care, and then also providing care for detransitioners, which is totally and thoroughly lacking throughout the medical industry at this time. So they're having a conference at the same time as the European Transgender Health organization is having their conference at the same place, so that people can see the difference in ideological flavor in Killarney.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, it should be fun. I kind of just stumbled into that topic, and it turned out that I just got to talk to everybody that's the total movers and shakers on changing the direction of gender healthcare.
Okay, so are they like doing things right now, and do they have organizations in place, or is it just bringing professionals in to start talking about it?
There's actually a lot of different organizations that have popped up over the last 2 years specifically, and GenSpect is one. GenSpect is more facing, trying to connect healthcare providers with people in need of healthcare, whether it's therapy or dealing with the medical advocacy, and they kind of do have kind of a research arm, but they're more just about providing a different, broader picture of what gender dysphoria is and what gender healthcare looks like, what therapy is actually. Right. And then there are other organizations that are doing that, like there's SAGM and PIT. There's all these different organizations that are kind of popping up that are focusing on different really targeting different things. Like, so there are clinical organizations that are just for professionals to get out, to broaden the discourse around that, because as you probably know, it's collapsed. You can't really even discuss the research anymore in all the professional organizations, the child pediatric associations, the healthcare associations, all the research in universities. They're kind of stripping off the research that's inconvenient to the transgender ideological push. So
yeah, which is terrifying if you've just detransitioned and then you just want answers.
Yeah.
People are just shoving you out the door.
Yeah, a lot of there's a lot of those detransitioners. They do need help, and they're on top of, the doctors might not know what to do because they already sent them to the gender clinic, so called, and then so the detransitioners just got PTSD from just being mistreated by this organization. Wow. And then the organization doesn't know, and now that the insurance doesn't want to pay for the detransition. Oregon State just said that they will not cover detransition at all. Even though they're fully covering all transition, they're not covering detransition at all. So if you get a botched surgery, or
I would imagine that's very expensive to just try to bring your body back to a healthy, normal working status.
Yeah, the informed consent isn't necessarily all that conformed, so therefore not all that consensual. We just don't really know what's going to happen when we pump your body full of these hormones for 40 years, starting at 13 or whatever. But that's the nitty gritty. You guys at New Polity focus on the high and lofty.
Yeah, it's fun being at a political theology think tank and trying to explain that to people. Just the idea of a think tank just sounds esoteric.
It sounds kind of shady, it's like literally the back room, like the smoky back room, right?
Right. But Andrew Willard-Jones is one of the professors who works here. I like the way that he explains it. It's just like a college, except there's no classes. It's just the academic portion that's there. So all the research, the writing, reading, producing, books, journals, those kinds of things that universities normally do.
So so like a research university kind of aim.
Right.
But what is the guiding principle, or what is the purpose, and does it change over time? Is there a specific purpose now? Are you guys trying to accomplish some sort of policy, or trying to make a specific point in a specific way, or?
Right. So when the journal initially launched, it was New Polity, journal for, I think, Catholic post-liberal thought. So it's a critique against liberalism as an ideology, mostly just because we're swimming in it and we don't see it, the assumptions that we're making. And so the idea, I guess from my perspective, this might not be how other people explain it. It just seems really obvious to me that there's a trickle-down effect with academics. I mean, that's where all the gender ideology came from. It began in the academic corners and then became something that is experienced on the ground level, I guess, in very practical ways. And so there has to be work done in the opposite, to fight against that, I suppose.
Yeah.
So for our think tank in particular, I suppose it's just exposing a lot of the assumptions of liberalism about the human person. One easy example, I think, would be...
So you guys are trying to redefine humanity in the post-liberal age. That's kind of like the direction that you're going. That's a very humble project.
Gosh, I wouldn't say redefining, just being actually Catholic.
Okay, yeah.
About the anthropology. But I think especially the way that Americans have picked up liberal ideology, we just tend to focus on practical solutions so much that sometimes you can switch around the order. Like, you really do need to think about where ideas come from before you just jump on solving the problem.
Okay.
sometimes taking a step backwards can give you better solutions instead of just trying more ways to like stop the hole in the dike, I guess.
Have you read any Jacques Ellul? I think he's a Calvinist, but he did a lot of theology. He has a very deep critique about liberalism, which he doesn't call liberalism. I think he calls it just technological society, and how everybody puts faith in the process, and the process just kind of runs the whole thing.
Right.
So I don't know how you re-engineer the process, because it seems like the process from his critique from other right-wing or post-liberal thinkers, the process is the process, and it's going to keep on doing. It's going to ignore everything that doesn't ramp up the process even more.
Right. What exactly is the question? Sorry, I just didn't quite follow.
I interrupted you. You're going to give me a concrete example of defining the human in a different way than the liberal way of defining the person.
I guess like one way that you could see the ideology manifesting would be looking at the human person and valuing them for their usefulness to society instead of seeing a primary dignity in them that comes from God. So I mean that's a very simple one. But if you're valuing someone only for their capacity to do things, then you end up just abusing the human person or creating structures in which people can be easily abused.
Yeah. So centering the dignity of the human being, and this is an interesting kind of wordplay, because there's Catholic social justice and then there's secular social justice, and they sound the same, but they might be different. But they both kind of try to attempt to center the dignity. They use a lot of the similar language. Do you see that pattern? And do you know the distinction between the dignity from your point of view and the dignity that you see in the secular world that's just kind of mobilizing people via their identities as marginalized, or as need to be saved in some way?
Right. I mean, I do think that a lot of that emphasis comes from Christian culture, because you did have a shift with the introduction of Christianity to suddenly every person has a dignity that comes from God. Like I guess connection to divinity isn't left to the priests alone, or to the kings and the powerful and those who pretend to be gods. But it's something that the peasant can have and that the commoner can have. And so I think that movement of thought has just shaped the modern West from that point on. And I would say that the main distinction with secularism is that it takes that idea and runs with it, but then leaves God and religion and the roots of the idea behind. But the idea of the dignity of the human person being central for the way that we do politics, I think, is at its core a Christian idea.
And what happens when you try to introduce God into politics again? Like, how does that shake out? I'm sure you guys are more careful than some, evangelical rabble rouser.
Right. Yeah. I think part of the critique that New Polity has comes a lot from Dr. Andrew Willard-Jones' insights. He wrote a book, Before Church and State, which is really helpful. But the basic idea is that before Enlightenment thinking, and really before the rise of absolutist monarchs, the idea of church and state being separated into the sorts of categories that we imagine them to be just didn't exist. Yeah. So in the Middle Ages, society was the church. And there wasn't a secular realm where God was irrelevant. Society was the church, but those who were in the church, some of them happened to be priests. some of them happened to be clergy, some of them happened to be religious, some of them happened to be lay people, and some of them happened to be lay people who were kings, and they had the temporal power. And so they were the ones who like wielded secular or like temporal authority.
Yeah.
And it wasn't as if the clergy had power to wield temporal, or at least they ought not wield like temporal authority. But so it's a closer intertwining than the way that we imagine it today. Everyone fit under the same society, I suppose, the same society of the church. And so I think that there is a kind of like reactionary traditionalist that wants to return to introducing God back into the society, where like, I don't know, like making a national religion and forcing people to comply into the religion. But I don't think that's I don't think that's a solution. I think that the solution would simply be like the conversion of the people, which is precisely what happened with Christianity in the first place. It's not like the Christians went into Rome and decided to take over all of their structures. The people were converted from within.
Yeah.
And so I think part of the reason why it's perhaps more difficult to follow some of the things that New Polity is saying is because, from what I can see, we're playing the long game. Like, this isn't a quick and easy solution. It depends on the free will of individuals and individual hearts. Which, that's a much more vulnerable way to go about, but it's the only way that really, I think, protects the dignity of the human person and people's free will.
Yeah. Yeah. So you think about, if there's so many problems with trying to think about America as Rome, but it's very tempting. You know, we're at the end of the empire, we're at the kind of the fall
Right.
of the Roman Empire. And if Christianity swept through Rome and introduced, you know, the Catholic Church to that entire, and by Catholic Church, I just mean that unified Catholic universal church to that whole empire, it was converting pagans into Christianity.
Right.
Now you're not dealing with pagans. You're dealing with post-Christians. You're dealing with people who have the remnants of Christianity already operating in them. You know,
Right.
In this, it keeps on coming back to that social justice stuff. Like, you have like the carapace of it. How do you? It's a different equation. Yeah, I mean, the Spirit does what the Spirit does, but have you guys discussed that? Like, what is the path forward towards conversion? Like, because insofar as you're going to be using words to do that, you're going to have to develop language and argumentation on some level to prepare the groundwork for individual conversion.
Right. I think that's a little bit what the Second Vatican Council was doing. So the most recent council, which is all the bishops getting together, uniting with the Pope, and the big discussion was, how do we, in part, change the language and approach what has changed since, I guess, the 17th century, because so much about society and the language that we use has been changed. There was a council before that, the First Vatican Council.
In the 17th century?
Things since the Industrial Revolution just changed society so drastically that the language that was being used to communicate just fell on deaf ears. So, yeah, how to communicate that going forward. Gosh, I mean, like, yeah, it's a different game, and it's a lot more difficult too, I think, because we've lost a more, I guess, symbolic worldview as modern people as a whole, which I think is even difficult for like Catholics and difficult for Christians, because our religion is deeply symbolic, and trying to live in a symbolic worldview or in a sacramental worldview, that's just not the modern world in which we inhabit. Everything is very like scientific and comes down to like facts and things that you can measure and quantify. And so things beyond that just seem superstitious and silly. And so trying to bring that kind of symbolic thinking back into a secular world is a lot more difficult, because I think part of the reason why the conversion of the Roman Empire happened so quickly was because like paganism is very symbolic in its thinking. And what I mean by symbolic is they just understood that the world is imbued with meaning. Like things are meaningful, events are meaningful, the stories that we tell are meaningful, and it's not just little stories that we tell ourselves. They have real and actual value that's transcends time, I think. So trying to like enter into a society that's completely devoid of those things, that is difficult.
Well, it's a natural process for people to gravitate back towards that meaningful worldview. And whenever somebody brings up meaning, you need to know what they mean by that, because it's just a black box. You can just lead to some sort of Gnosticism or weird. We can start doing some Freemasonry in the background without really carefully defining that. But you say like something that transcends time, something that transcends quantifiable. It's a different way of seeing.
Right. Yeah.
It's a different way of seeing and relating to the world.
Right. I think kind of maybe an easy way of thinking about it is that like our bodies are symbolic and express meaning. So if I like shake someone's hand or use like respectful body language, it is kind of relative depending on your culture. Like for us, shaking hands is a sign of respect, but that symbol that I'm participating in isn't totally arbitrary. It has to do with actual reality. Like it is an expression of openness and vulnerability to extend one's hand to another. So there's a reason that we choose the symbols that we do. And then I think the next step would be seeing that those symbols are imbued with a moral content. So
moral content.
Yeah, a moral content. Like it can be something good or something evil. So if I extend my hand, but that's a lie, I'm extending my hand, but you can't see it. If I extend my hand and it's a lie, I don't actually want to extend vulnerability and friendship. Like that's a moral content. I've lied with my body. I think that kind of imagination is the symbolic or sacramental worldview.
Yeah. And which really easily slides into gender, where you have this re-sacralization of the human body, but through the postmodern framework, or the post-liberal framework, or the late stage leftist framework. Right. It's all centers the will.
Totally. And I think that's a very flat worldview. My body has no meaning.
Inherent meaning.
It's no inherent meaning. There is no expression that comes from my body that is a truth of who I am. There's no inherent goodness to it. It's just kind of a blank canvas, and I get to express my will as I desire it. And I think that can be very desirable to people, but it ultimately does fall flat because people don't care to a degree. Like a lot of people don't care what you have to say. Like you're just speaking into the void. And then, the only meaning that's there is coming from yourself. And I think to a certain extent, we all realize that that's inadequate. And we have to prop other people around in our lives to affirm that the meaning that we have imbued into the thing is actually worthwhile.
Yeah.
But from a sacramental or a symbolic worldview, my body is inherently good and it expresses a meaning, and there's a moral content to it. Part of what makes my body meaningful is because I can participate in acts of goodness towards other people and towards myself. And one of those acts is accepting the gift of myself that I did not choose. I did not choose my gender.
Yeah.
Receiving it as a gift, and then accepting that identity and exploring what does that mean? What does it mean to accept the gift of myself and to give the gift of myself? But if you've rejected that at the very beginning, then like you can't actually participate in that gift.
Yeah.
Which
entails a submission, like a primary submission. You have to submit to reality before you can participate in reality. And there's this mind virus that we live in our culture right now, that we will not submit to anything. Reality issues from us, first and foremost, from consent, not submit, right?
Right. And I think what people miss is that there's a real freedom in submission, and that just sounds so wrong to our American ears, modern ears in general. And that is one thing that I experienced at the monastery, like the freedom in submission. Because if you want to participate in reality, you do just have to submit to it. Like if I want to be an excellent pianist, I just have to submit to reality, and I have to submit to the reality that it takes a lot of practice. And so there is, like I have to say no to a lot of things, like all the things that I want to do with my time in order to practice piano over and over again. But it's in the submission and in going through the hardship that you end up experiencing the freedom on the other side and all the creativity that you can. So I think when it comes to gender, you do experience a freedom in submitting, because you yourself come to discover you as gift and what that means in a particular way. And I can understand why women could rebel against that. I suppose I'm thinking of women in particular, just because a lot of this began from feminist movements.
Don't tell the feminists that.
But there is a meaning to woman, but the way that's expressed is not. I don't know. There's a lot of creativity within that, and I think maybe it seems to me that there's not actually a lot of freedom in transgender ideology, because you're a man or a woman and you're looking at yourself and you're saying, well, I like to do these things that seem to be expression of the opposite sex. But instead of exploring what does that mean to be me as a male and do this, or me as a female and do these things, I have to just switch.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there's actually less creativity.
Well, if we go into that direction, that discussion, there, from my research, which isn't research proper, just my conversations with people who have gotten swept up into it, there's a lot of different ends to it, and it could be escape from the meaning of being a woman. A lot of detransitioned females say that transition was an escape from the meaning of being a woman. So what is the meaning? What is the content of being a woman? It's only seen as a negative. It's seen as an object of desire, as somebody who's weak, who can't play, who can't do, is limited on all these different ways, and then is also a vector for male attention and the powerlessness in front of male desire. And to escape all of that and become a man, become a boy, you become immune to all of that attention. You become immune to all those negative stereotypes, all that meaning. You're playing with meaning because the meaning's problematic, right? So it's not, on that vector, I understand that, but how would you speak to the beauty and the power and the grace and the gift that is woman? I think that's a major aspect that's missing from our world, is being able to really see the gift that is woman, to define the woman as a woman beyond just a gamete producer. Right.
Yeah, I think to kind of go back to the idea of the flat world, that rebelling against the meaning of woman is rebelling against a flat image of what it means to be woman, because if we just live in a world that's merely material and there is no further meaning or symbolic or moral content to my identity, then what is to prevent you from being reduced to your biology or being reduced to your utility, whether it's the pleasure of other people or becoming a mother and just pumping out kids? Yeah, that's one thing I do think that Christianity, or at least Catholic Christianity, was able to kind of insert into the world in a very new way, particularly through monastic communities, female monastic communities. Because when you think about it this way, it's actually quite remarkable. So here you have an institution of women run by women, and they're set up not for their biological utility. They're not there for the pleasure of men. They're there because they're made to seek God. And because it's an institution, it means that the entire society recognized this as being valid and of value. And so when you're a woman entering into a society like that, you live in a world in which it is true that like woman has an inherent meaning that transcends the everyday, that transcends the biological, that transcends her utility. And that just changes your imagination, I think. And that's not to say that every woman experience that sort of freedom. You know, like there's still imperfect human societies. But I mean, you at least live in the possibility of it. What was that?
Labor is labor. The female reproductive capacity is a very great burden. I don't think you can, even the Bible says that right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that is something that you don't see before in pagan societies, because there were women who held prominent positions or were priestesses, but I think even then they were kind of reduced to a useful function, and a lot of them ended up being involved in like ritual prostitution. Like they really ended up being like under the gaze of men. But this is the first time, and I could be wrong, but it seems that there's a very unique institution that's just under the gaze of other women. It's run by women for a sake that's, beyond just mere utility. And it was really funny to me when I was doing more research on this, and kind of how modern liberal regimes pushed back on female monastic communities, the things that they were saying about the institutions and the women. Like feminists would get very upset about what these people were writing, because they're essentially like, excuse me, there's whole institutions of women. Like, how can we trust women whose emotions are all over the place? They're crazy. I mean, these people can't like run an institution. It's unsafe for them. They need to be under the gaze of men, essentially, in order to make sure that things were okay.
And this was the reasoning during, am I correct in saying this is the reasoning that was published during the French Revolution when they kind of broke up the church? Is that some of the stuff you're referencing?
French Revolution, the one that I was referencing was from Germany in the 19th century.
Okay.
But yeah, that whole era, and across Europe, there was monasteries closed over a period of couple hundred years. And that was in part of the argument that women couldn't be trusted in those institutions.
Okay. Well, what were they entrusted with in those institutions? They just had some property and they're praying, right? Did they have nuclear warheads or something? Are they developing some sort of nasty virus up there?
So you found them out. That's what they were doing all along. No, I think they just it's just a life of liturgical prayer. I think part of the critique was you could convince yourself that you were seeing visions, and maybe like women who are more emotional, they go into prayer, and because they really want to have a certain experience, or they want God to speak to them in a certain way, that they imagine that they're speaking to God in this way. I mean, this has happened countless times in church history. Like people will come forward as visionaries, and then the church will look into it, and it turns out, oh, okay, you just had schizophrenia or something like that.
Okay. What is the diagnostic criteria of a visioness? Like, how do you know? How do they know? How do we tell?
Well, in the ones that the church has looked into, the first thing that you would look into is that the holiness of the person, like their own character. And then you would also look into the content of the vision. Is it contradicting anything that's in the Bible? So if it was, well, that's probably an indicator that this is not authentic. Same with comparing it against church teaching, other accepted writings. And even then, it's not as if the church asserts that like this person is beyond a doubt a visionary and everyone ought to believe the things that they said. It's like, well, we don't see anything wrong here. You're free to believe what you want about this person and their visions.
Yeah.
So that's as far as what the church does. But it is helpful because there are people who do lie. and there are people who are insane and will pretend to be visionaries. And those are really interesting to look into.
And some of them are even women. What's some fascinating things that you found, these stories of visionaries?
Oh gosh. There's some recent ones that I was interested in.
Oh, really?
That I don't think is legitimate at all. It's been a while since I've looked into it. But people were expecting it's another end of the world thing. But coming from like Catholic visionaries, and there's a charismatic priest up in Canada, I think, that was growing a following and posed himself as the new Saint Paul, and then the persecution that he was experiencing from the bishop, who just wanted to figure out what the heck he was saying, and like, why aren't you like obeying my authority? Because he's under his diocese, he needs to make sure that whatever is going on in his diocese is actually like authentic. I mean, he's the pastor. This guy wasn't really complying and was construing the bishop doing his job as persecution.
What was the content of his message?
It is supposedly old. Gosh, what was it called?
Was he dictating the end of the world, or saying something about
Yes,
the rise of the Antichrist?
There's a title. It's like the Great something like that. I'm not sure. But the idea is that there is going to be a pre-end of the world event in which the sign of the cross was going to appear in the sky, and like everyone would see it, and like time would stop. And then it got more ridiculous as things went on. I think at one point this guy claimed that like planes would freeze in the air, like time would really stop like that. I knew of people who were kind of into it. So I thought, what the heck? I need to figure out what this is. And then I looked into it, and I'm just very creeped out. There's crazy people everywhere.
There are. So just to round out the point that you were saying earlier about the meaning of the woman in the West, and having the nun there as an image of the capacity of the woman to not be useful, to face and pursue wholly a life of prayer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it
does have a use insofar as it just rounds out or extends the meaning of the category woman.
I think I mean there's a positive vision, which is that like the deepest meaning of woman, I think, is to seek God and to receive him. And I think that like the human person, like man and woman, are different I don't know, like symbolic manifestations of the reality of God. I mean, it's the idea that all of creation reflects God in some manner or another. Yeah. And I think woman in particular highlights our capacity to receive God, and our ability to like receive life and to bear it. And so it's like we're a particular highlighted symbol. It's not that that's the only thing to which like we can do like physically, like give birth to children, but it's helpful having that symbol there in a concentrated form, because it reminds humanity of our position before God. We are the ones who receive from the giver, the initiator, so to speak. And I think that men as fathers are able to like highlight again a particular symbol about God, about like God's initiation and bringing like action and life. And so just different aspects of revealing God and revealing our relationship to him. I think.
Is that reflected in the tonality and the flavor of the writings of the nuns versus the monks, like how they end up, the knowledge that they produce insofar as they do, or the stories or whatever they do that does trickle out of the monastery into the world via stories, probably, or theologies, maybe. Is it reflected, the capacity of the woman or the difference of the woman and the man, the nun and the monk?
I think so. The spirituality of the like female and male monasteries is definitely different, and I'm not sure I could describe it or put a word to it. But I think women are more easily able to enter into the symbol of the bride of Christ. So Saint Paul is really a very mystical writer, and I think that we miss that when we read him. He can sound rather legalistic, but I think most of what he's writing is very mystical, and he uses all of these analogies to describe the church and like our relation as a social body united to Christ and united to the divine, and one of them is the bride. And so it comes down to the question of like, how can we, if God wants to bring us into his communion, and if God wants to bring us into his divinity, how is he going to do that when like we're not of the same kind as him? And so the analogy that is used in the Old Testament and used in the New Testament is that of bride, of marriage. Even though you're not of the same blood, you become one anyway in this covenantal relationship. And so the idea of being the bride of Christ is something that's a lot easier for women to enter into that imagination, into that symbol. So you can see that in like the prayers or the attitude, the spirituality, the kinds of things that are written, but it's not limited to women alone. So John of the Cross, I think, is a great example of someone who really entered into that bridal imagery. He wrote a lot of very beautiful poems about being bride, essentially. There's so the way I'm seeing it is that there's different aspects of being the church. Part of it is being bride. Part of it, I think, is also being son. So you have like female symbolism and you also have male symbolism, but it's not like sonship only belongs to men or being bride only belongs to women. It's something that's for the whole church, but it's easier for women to enter into one than the other and men to enter into one than the other, but it's for all of us.
So you're saying that there's many different gender identities in the mystical doctrine of Catholicism. How do you engage through the symbol of the sun then? How does that make salient your contemplation or your meaning making?
I think this has to go back to Jewish culture and what the firstborn son meant for them. The firstborn son is the inheritor. He's the one who receives the rulership from his father and receives the fullness of the inheritance. And so another analogy that the Bible uses of how God communicates his divinity through us is by inheritance. It's the Father giving it to his Son. So I am a daughter of God, or I'm a son of God because I inherit the merits of Jesus Christ. I inherit salvation, and it's as a gift from a father to a son. It's not something that the son earns. He never merited his father's inheritance. His father is the one who worked for it, but it's something that the son receives
and is the steward of.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
It's kind of like a husbandmanship of your life. Like
right.
That which is given to me is also that which is given for me to cultivate. So the meaning in the symbols, it's not even the next step saying, okay, well, we're not made out of matter, we're made out of meaning, but I still have an act. I'm still participating, I'm still cultivating, I'm still building value, increasing value in my life, participating in the perfection of myself.
Yeah, I really do like the image from Genesis of man being the gardener, because when you're given the gift of creation, you're not the one who imbues creation with its natures. You have to receive it as it is, and you have to be attentive to that reality, and then you have to submit to it and work with it and cultivate it if you want it to bear fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, but that can slip into that in that Genesis metaphor. I can sense just the. Well, I mean, there's always a snake there, right? There's always a serpent there, and like you can sense the Promethean in the Western Promethean man kind of being born at the same time. Like, I'm here to. Nature is given to me. I'm here to master nature. I'm here to start to play around with nature. And you have the scientific thing. Right. The control.
True, and I think that's where Genesis comes back in again, because it seems that the way the narrative is written is that the commission to be gardener is ultimately oriented towards worship. There's a lot of temple imagery that's weaved throughout the text that you wouldn't see unless
you had a degree in Hebrew.
I wish I did. But I've been taught by people who do. Yeah. So the temple imagery is there. The 7 days is also something symbolic, and especially because God rested on the seventh. And invited humanity to enter into the rest. And so that's very significant, because the gardening isn't just progress for progress' sake to go on forever. The point of it is to enter into the rest of God. And so you're constantly using that as a value check of the work that you're doing. That ties in a little bit to a New Polity thought, like where our lives are oriented to enter into the rest of God and to enter into worship. So when I'm looking at the structures that I'm participating in, the structures that I'm building, is it oriented towards that goal? Or is my goal simply to make more money, or to become more efficient, or do more things and produce more, even if it's really fantastic things that you're doing? Yeah. It just, life takes on a very different rhythm if your goal is the rest, prayer, contemplation, and worship of God. I think all those things are kind of wrapped up together. And so with nuns in particular, that's just, again, like a highlighted symbol of it. Not everyone has to do what nuns do, but they do serve as a reminder of the ultimate rhythm of our lives.
The orientation. We're lifting the world, or we're building a temple out of the garden.
Right. Yeah. The whole of our lives, I think, is meant to be an act of worship. And I think that's what Genesis reveals. Like in the beginning, like worship and entering into the rest of God is not just limited to liturgical acts that happen on occasion, but is really like the whole society that one builds. The whole garden is the offering.
What is worship? Oh, you said offering, so that's interesting, because there is an ancient conception of offering and sacrifice, but worship is different.
I think those are part of worship.
Okay. Worship subsumes them. What is it subsuming into? Like, what is it?
I think it's it kind of follows the pattern of the exitus reditus. Like all things come forth from the hand of God. So there's like the exit. We receive our natures, and we receive our orientation, and we receive it as a gift. And then worship is making the return to God, giving back to God not merely what is His, but producing something, using our natures to create something good and beautiful. So it's basically the parable of the talents. Jesus uses the analogy of giving like money to different persons, and to different persons he gives different amounts, and the expectation is that they go out and they use the money in order to make more money and bring it back to the king. And so I think that's a good analogy for the act of worship. Like I've been given the gift of my life, and my gift back to God is what I do with it. And so it, again, like there's a highlighted symbol that I enter into in liturgical worship, but it's really like the mountaintop moment. It's not as if any other part of my life isn't a part of my worship.
Oriented towards that. Okay, so I'm trying to step trying to be inside of our conversation and then outside looking in
Outside.
our conversation, because there's these different words that are stumbling blocks for people to understand the content of
Right.
what we're trying to communicate. And
Yeah, thank you.
one of those words is worship. One of the words is, which I'd like to talk about briefly, is the mystical. You said something about the mystical, Paul, but before we get to that, you use this word God over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, so this is the linchpin. Is that a symbol? What is the symbolic content of this symbol that you pronounce as the word God? Like, what is
God.
that?
Yeah,
God.
well, the word is symbolic. But God is like he reveals his name as I am who am, being itself, the Alpha and the Omega, the one from whom being comes forth, and to whom all being is driven to return, is oriented to return. I the basic Catholic conception of God, I think, is the philosopher's conception of God as being itself. But what's different with the revelation of the New Testament as opposed to what like Plato or Aristotle would have discovered is the revelation that being is also love and goodness. I'm not sure if that helps.
Okay, this is a side that we don't need. I'm just going to ask the question. Don't know where it's going to lead,
Okay.
but like, if being is good, I hate this, but I'm going to bring it up anyways, because I hear the people outside the conversation say, "Well, what about evil? Like what about all the suffering and the pain in the world? Like, being isn't good. Being isn't love. Being is difficult. Being is red in tooth and claw. Being is vital and violent and a struggle."
Right.
And power, devouring itself endlessly. So how does that square?
Yeah, I think the best way is to go back into the symbolic language of Genesis. So if God is the source of all being and is creating a diversity of things within creation, like the fall, evil, and suffering would be a refusal, like to enter into one's own nature, a refusal to enter into the pattern. There's a disruption in the natural order of things, and
Yeah.
that kind of has a snowball effect. So if you look at, I guess when I look at the evil in myself, if I am like committing self hatred or acts of self hatred, or like cutting myself, for example,
Yeah.
I'm not acting in accordance with reality, with the gift that I am. I'm creating disharmony, I guess, with reality and rebelling against that. So, like, the act of self hatred is not something that like, God introduces into the world, but is a disruption of the pattern and a disruption of the
Yeah.
harmony, not in accordance with the reality of my own goodness.
Yeah, there's this concept of original sin in your sacred text, but it's tied intimately to choice, to conscious, to will. Like, the will is again in the garden right there. Like, you can or you
Right.
can't. You can refuse. You are not an animal that is just going to work out its animal nature and adapt to its environment. You can choose.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's different kinds of suffering out there. Like, there's just natural suffering. But I think for at least the like moral suffering, moral evils, that's very obviously choices of other people or choices of myself. So it's something that isn't primarily an act of God. Like, it's
Yeah.
not coming from that source. It's coming from me. And perhaps even like natural evils too, are difficulty of having harmony with the created order also comes from that disordered relationship with God. So in the Genesis text, the way it appears that first read is that like nature was perfect. It was this amazing and beautiful garden. Then there was the fall, and after that, there's thorns and thistles, and Adam has to actually work. My favorite interpretation of that, and I think it makes the most sense, is that like there were always thorns and thistles in the world, but it wasn't experienced as a hardship. Because there is a point of thorns and thistles actually existing in the created order. But if you're working in harmony with what those are for, then you don't experience them as the enemy. It's something that you work with instead.
Yeah, yeah. So then, so back to that word mystical. That's a difficult word for people who are outside looking in the conversation. This language, this set of language.
Right.
So, what is that? What is the content of something being mystical? Is that just like metaphorical, or is it speaking to a certain sort of engagement and reality or attitude?
I think it has to do with communication. So when I'm communicating with you, I'm communicating at a natural level, and kind of the normal way that I communicate with words, using my body, like using a voice box and my mouth.
Yeah.
Okay, natural communication. If I'm going to communicate with the divine, I have to start making some steps in different directions to communicate at a different level, because
Huh.
God, as spirit, doesn't have body. And if you start thinking about that, like if God is the source of being, but isn't material himself, and his natural mode of communication isn't going to have a lot of the normal things that we use to communicate. So God's communication is not normally or naturally through feeling. That's something that he can choose to manifest because he wants to get your attention. But that's not his natural mode of communicating. That's just something for us, or through seeing things. Like he can use images, but that's not the natural way that he communicates, because again, he doesn't have a body. So the way that the church uses the word mystical is rather specific, I think. It's a very broad term, and different religions use it different ways, so it can be very confusing. But at least from the Catholic tradition, if you hear that someone's like a mystic saint, it's usually referring to a depth of intimacy that they have with God, and the kind of prayer communication that they enter into. So I think, understanding spirit as being intellect and will, or thought and love, right? Because if God is not material, what are the only things that we can like really think of that are like immaterial but are real, like moving forces in the world? Our minds and our wills and our capacity to love. And so that's the way that God primarily communicates. And so there's ways that he can communicate directly to and through the will, and to and through the intellect. And so the way that the mystic writers have talked about it, it seems to be that there's 3 general stages in the spiritual life of how God slowly lifts the soul into that communication, because you can't do it all at once. That'd be super bizarre and very overwhelming.
Probably break them. He'd break you.
Yeah, I think so. And so the way that you begin prayer is through more natural means. So like you look at scripture and you read it and you meditate on it and you think about it, and then God can inspire like good and helpful thoughts to help you understand the thing that you're reading. So there's like spiritual stuff happening there, but it's still at a pretty natural level, or even like visions or God speaking to you through your imagination. That's still more on the natural level, because that's a very normal human function, like thinking of words and seeing images.
Yeah.
Or I don't know if, there's just so many people that I know who have had experiences of just like they were walking down the street and all of a sudden they got this gut feeling like, turn around now. That seems to be like a spiritual, more like natural communication of God that he can manifest.
Yeah.
And then the mystical seems to be when you're transitioning into the second and third stages. Some people have given them titles. So the first one is purgative, the second one is illuminative, and there's a transition where in prayer, God communicates directly to the intellect, but not primarily through sensorial experiences, like through the senses. And so it's most often referred to as contemplative prayer. And it can be really confusing for the soul going through that because it feels like you're doing something useless. Like you're just like deeply moved into like love of God, or maybe God just kind of reveals something like his glory. And so you could say like, I see God's glory, but it's not like you're seeing anything. Like your intellect has just been open up to that reality in a way that you obviously didn't do because you can't just force that on your own. And like your heart being like overwhelmed with love for like the goodness and glory of what you're seeing, like that's maybe not something that you could just like force on your own. Yeah, those things have to be more of invitations from God. And so progressing along that route would be the mystical life. And there's a lot that I can't speak to because I'm not very advanced.
Oh, okay. You're not a mystic yet.
That would be great one day. I've had
Careful what you wish for, Maria.
Typically it comes along with a lot of suffering, so you're right. But I remember the first time that I was reading writers like Saint Teresa of Avila or Saint John of the Cross when they're describing their spiritual journey and how they have gone through those stages. So it's really helpful to have the writings of people who have gone through it. And I remember when I was reading it, I'm like, this sounds ridiculous. Like, can I really believe that this is actually true? And I'm not saying that like I've advanced very far at all, but I think certain experiences within the past couple of years have kind of opened me up to realizing, oh, wow, like I think they are right. Like, I think this is real.
There's a reality there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can tell that they're just writing from like such a depth, and they're struggling for words to describe their experience. And so like I remember when I was reading it, I'm like, this kind of sounds like a cop out. But what if it's true? What if it's true that there are things that really do transcend words? And if God is beyond the material order, it would make sense that he would be beyond our words to be able to describe him, that things would just fall short. But we could use analogies to kind of get at it, which is what I think you see in St. Paul. And I think that's what you see in those writers. Well, we can't get to it directly, but we can kind of approach it by analogy.
Yeah. Well, I understand how one would be called to be a receiver of those experiences, but it's another calling to even try to communicate them, or to be called to communicate them. Is it just kind of a part of the tradition of the Catholic monks and nuns that they just end up writing? It's just kind of part of the culture. They're always communicating. They're always doing homilies. So it's just part of communication of what's going on with them is just kind of standard. It's just what's always, or is it kind of special for somebody to write a book about that aspect of life, the mystical?
I think it varies. Different people are interested in writing.
Like emails.
Yeah, and some people are not interested in them at all. I think I know some orders they're very into the humility thing, and so they'll write, but it's really for their own edification. And when they die, they go in the ground and they have a marker for their tomb, but no name on it, and then all of their writings are thrown away.
Really?
Yep.
Wow. What's a name of one of these orders? That's pretty hardcore.
I don't know which one does that. It might be Carthusian. They're pretty intense.
Carthusians?
Yeah.
Do they live on a ship? The Carthusian ship? Are they like, where's this? Is this in Greek? In Greece? Carthusians.
I think they're a branch of, oh man, people are going to get mad. I think they're a branch of Franciscans.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure, although I did visit a Carthusian monastery up in Wisconsin a
Okay.
couple weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Um,
Good
well,
food?
it has
What was the culture there like?
the food was so much better than the last monastery I was at,
Oh, really?
but the weather was much worse.
Oh, okay. There's always
It was
trade-offs.
freezing.
Really?
I think what was the most interesting thing about the habits of the Carthusians, well, I mean, first of all, it was just cold, and their monastery is losing a lot of heat because the building is so old. They're getting a new building, but I was watching the sisters walk around and they had hats over their veils. Just layering up, like they just look so cold.
Oh, no.
But they have these choir robes, so they have a normal habit, just a brown kind of dress thing, but
Yeah.
then their choir robe is this, and so it's a white robe that they put on top, but they have very long sleeves that go far past their hands and are very tall, I suppose, kind of like the princess gown sleeves, like
Okay.
from medieval ages.
Yeah.
And so like you push them up like to your wrists, and then yeah, you just have these like massive sleeves that are just kind of in the way, to be honest. But for some reason, it just looks really cool.
Weird. I wonder where that came from. That must have been a
I
moment
was
in history.
I was asking the prioress, and I think part of it is because, well, she was saying like, yeah, you really can't do anything in a choir robe. Like sometimes she's rushed from saying prayers in their choir loft to try to like go do the dishes, and like you can't do it with those kinds of sleeves. And I think the point is like, all right, now you're putting on the robe. It's time to pray, and you can't do anything else except for
Oh,
pick
yeah.
up this book.
Yeah. Okay. Is there like some sort of ology that just studies like the orders like a just a branch of study that just studies the heredity, like there's got to be a
I'm sure
word
there
that yeah that encapsulates all the knowledge that I'm testing you with all these different.
not that I know of, but there probably is. I'm sure. And the orders, they know. They take careful care to remember their history with their chronicles and things like that.
When maybe one way of communicating what we're trying to communicate or talk about what we're trying to talk about to people who don't necessarily agree or believe or understand us would be
Yeah,
to
I want to apologize to those people. I just get excited about topics. So thank you for just pulling back and just redefining some words.
but okay, so when you come across a mystic text of what I was just listening to your talk with Jacob, St. Catherine of Siena, who
Oh
wrote
yeah.
some texts. You have to change your attention. You have to, like, your mind mode, it goes into a different mode. Even different than when you're reading a prayer, reading a psalm, reading the Bible is also, and the Bible itself, like, has so many different forms, so many different genres. So it's kind of speaking to you in different ways, or you approach it in different ways under different times of day, or when you're looking for things, or whatever you bring to the text. So I wonder if the mystical writings are kind of a distillation of a very specific type of attention, and if you, when you read them, if you notice that they work on you or they work on your attention differently than a knowledge book or an email or something like that, and if there is a quality to that difference that you can describe.
Um. Uh. Well, I guess a mystic text is kind of a broad category. So if
You
it,
sent me a couple
yes,
PDFs. I think I was slightly I got frustrated with them because
I'm
sometimes
sorry.
no, and then I wasn't I got frustrated specifically because sometimes it feels like you shouldn't be using your mind when engaging with this stuff, and having a PDF before me is always
Oh,
about my mind is engaged. This is the problem with going to church to me, because like it's in English, so
right.
it engages my mind, and I just get really offended by that because God has not got to through language for me. Language is for the world.
Got it. Yeah. Well, I think everyone has their own way of approaching God. But the mystic writers, yeah, I think it's helpful. So looking at Teresa of Avila, which is one of the texts I think that I sent you, is Interior Castle,
Yeah.
and John of the Cross. It's helpful to know who they're writing to. So the texts are actually quite practical, and it's not extraordinarily esoteric. There's symbolic and analogical language, because there's certain things that, okay, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like this analogy.
Yeah.
But they are writing to other nuns and other friars who are just trying to advance in the spiritual life and know what's going on in their prayer. And I do think that you have to kind of begin from the beginning, and that's pretty much the advice that they give. Like, we are physical creatures, and so we have to begin with approaching God in those ways. And so in that way, liturgy starts to make a lot of sense as the way that you start climbing that ladder. And it's not something that you can ever do away with either, because we are human. We always need to like enter into like the like our human experience and start ordering that to the divine. So I guess one way of thinking about it, if you are trying to enter into prayer, like you do kind of enter into like liturgical acts, because your body and your spirit are so closely united. So you want to remove yourself from distractions, from noises, because you're affected by them. You want to keep your body still and in a posture that is like comfortable and like allows you to just like focus on like your prayer, right? I mean, those are very simple things. Like when it comes to like the liturgy in the mass, it's a little bit different, because you're doing something that's a communal act of worship, and so you're all engaging in like actions that are symbolic, but they have a moral content to it. So when we're all making the sign of the cross together, what we're doing is professing a belief, which is a moral act, but I'm doing it with my body. And not only am I doing it alone, I'm doing it as a community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a lot of the mystic writings would be like practical. And so they say that the way that you begin is with meditation, with scripture. Like get to know scripture intimately, meditate on it as often as possible, like memorize it.
Could you define meditate? Because that can have a couple of meanings.
In this sense, because you're right, there is a lot of different meanings. It's about applying the mind. Like God gave you a mind, and he gave you scripture so that you can engage it. Like he gave you like this treasure, and so you should enter into it and start mining for gold. And so meditation is the form of prayer that involves like thought and thinking through things. So it could be like looking at scripture and reading about the life of Jesus and really trying to enter into like, well, what are you revealing about yourself right now? What is this reveal about me? How can I apply this to my life? That's all like very, very like mental, and I'm the one kind of driving the conversation. I'm constantly open to inspirations while I'm doing that. But like I'm putting in like the hard work at the front end to kind of dispose myself for whatever God wants to do further on in prayer. Does that kind of make sense? Have you had favorite revelations in the meditation process? Something where you go eureka or yeah. Recently I've been asking God to draw me more into the Passion, because I've never really been drawn to like, I don't know, like the crucifixion. Like I was always just a cerebral kid. I just like liked ideas. And I think some people they gravitate to like Jesus going through suffering because it like means something to them and their suffering. But I liked ideas. Yeah. But I wanted to enter more into that. And I think what is most interesting to me about the Passion narrative is the way that Jesus interacts with authority. Figures of authority. Like the humility of Jesus has been very, very striking to me because it wasn't what I anticipated it to be. I think a lot of people look at the humility of Jesus, or like you hear people talking about humility and it sounds like, you're just supposed to roll over and just get kicked. Like, yes, you are better than me and I suck. That's right.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jesus's silence in the Passion narrative seems to be an act of humility. He's not going to assert himself to people who do not want to listen. So there's three very interesting interactions. One with Pilate, one with Caiaphas, and then the other with King Herod. So when Jesus is brought before Pilate, you can kind of tell that there's somewhat of an openness and curiosity in Pilate. Like, you can see that something is very different with this man and this situation. But he hasn't really given himself up to the possibility that, like, there could be something more here. Like, there's some kind of barrier, and, like, frankly, I don't know what it is. And so when Pilate questions Jesus, he actually answers him. But he does so in kind of an evasive way.
He's almost kind of snarky. I always feel bad for Pilate. I'm like, you're getting raked over the coals, man. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Like, and Jesus is kind of being a jerk, there from my reading.
I think what's going on is that he can see the heart of Pilate, and so he's giving him what he's asking for. He doesn't really want to ask for the full thing. Like, you can kind of tell that he's holding back, especially in the final question, like, quid est veritas? What is truth? Like, that's kind of a skeptical kind of like dismissal. Like, I can't come to know the truth. And so if you don't believe that you can come to know the truth, then why are you asking? And so I think Jesus doesn't respond fully because he's not asking for it. With Herod, he doesn't say anything at all because Herod just treats him as an object of interest. Like, he has heard all about Jesus and he just wants Jesus to perform a little miracle. And he's not even asking authentically. So Jesus says absolutely nothing. Before Caiaphas, Jesus also says nothing because Caiaphas is malicious. Caiaphas, I mean, he has read the scriptures. Like, I think Caiaphas knows who Jesus is, and refuses.
What's Caiaphas's role, or his station?
He's the high priest.
He's the high priest, yeah, okay.
And what I noticed, reading that is that Jesus doesn't respond to him and to the accusations, because the accusations that Caiaphas brings against him are false, and he's also not authentic about any of the questions that he's asking. And the only time that he gets Jesus to respond is when he actually invokes God himself. So he invokes Yahweh, and then Jesus is compelled to respond. And I think that seeing the way that Jesus interacts with those three characters is very telling that God really respects our freedom and he gives what you're asking for.
And doesn't
and I noticed that about myself
play footsie.
too. Yeah. I will ask things of God. I get frustrated with silence, and then later I'll return to those things and realize, like, I didn't want answers. There's a really neat witness testimony given by a man named Roy Schoeman, who was raised Jewish, then became an atheist when he went to Harvard Law School.
Thanks, Harvard.
Yeah. But he ended up receiving a very extraordinary grace, and you can find this online, this testimony.
What's his name again?
Roy Schoeman.
Okay.
He received an intellectual vision of God. Like, God just revealed himself to him in a very drastic way. And at the end of this vision, he was just overwhelmed with the presence of this divinity and how deeply he was loved, how meaningful his life was, and also how meaningful all of his actions were, both the good and the evil that he had done. And all he wanted to do was worship this divinity, whoever he might be. And he didn't care at that point. Like, whatever religion, like, you are, like, I will follow it, except if you're Christ, and I have to become Christian. Huh. And so this divinity did not reveal himself, just kind of faded. And And it wasn't until years later in another vision that he received, this time with Mary, that suddenly he realized that the divinity that he had experienced several years ago was in fact the Christ. But yeah, he asked not to be Christian, and so God respected what he wanted.
Yeah.
So I was seeing that story and line up with the way that God was acting in the New Testament, and then I was also seeing that line up with my own life and my own experiences as well.
When you're being Caiaphas or Herod or Pilate in prayer.
Oh, I think Herod. I think
You're a Herod.
Yeah.
Really?
Like, well, like prove yourself to me, God.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I think I like really let go of that entirely. Like I'm not seeking like myself in the scriptures. I don't want just answers for me. I just want to love you. Like what do you have to say to me? What do you want to reveal about yourself to me? And then prayer ended up being more fruitful when I was able to change the attitude. But I always fall back into the prove yourself to me mode, or I just want my own answers.
I think that's good. Maybe not directed toward spiritual understanding or wisdom, but that nature of yours is really vital in discovering the truth and dealing with pesky human beings via internet or in person, right? Or kind of being a hard-nosed woman, in Ohio, living life, So it's just these aspects of us, like a willful 2-year-old, like when I worked with kids, like this kid is impossible, and I'd get really mad or get really frustrated, but then you just say, no, this is his gift, and my job is to help him refine his gift or her gift. This gift is going to get them very far in life. It just needs to be directed in the right way. So, that's the one thing about the spiritual life, or at least spiritual literature and theology, and even largely construed belief largely construed, that I think needs to be really carefully delineated, is that this is a mode of being that's for a certain, it goes in a certain direction, and it doesn't work when it's put in these other directions. Like the theology is meant for a certain thing. It doesn't necessarily do this other thing, or my mind, my thought, my imagination is good for certain things, but it shouldn't be used to try to interact with I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's just there can be a lot of woo, right? And one object is to diminish the woo in order to have a really solid, clear faith and spirituality and spiritual practice, right? Because the woo kind of creeps in whenever we go into the spiritual or discussions of the spiritual, discussions of the religious. And I like what Jacob said in your episode on St. Catherine of Siena about he just said something that was really interesting to me about these different kinds of theology, and they're aimed towards contemplative theology. Like there's symbolic theology and there's contemplative theology. And I resist even thinking that theology is even proper in relationship to God. It's like that which informs your posture when you're going through an act, but it's not the act itself. Like I worry about theology becoming a veil.
Yeah, it can be a distraction. I don't think that's using it well. Like I think that theology is just us approaching God as humans. And if I'm approaching God with my whole being, that includes my mind. So if he's revealed himself in creation, like I ought to apply my mind to it, and see what it is that he's revealing to me about himself, or if he's revealing himself in scripture. So I do think that, you do need to approach God through the mind, if God is being and goodness and love, but also truth. So I guess like in the approach to God, you want to approach with your whole self, which includes the intellect. So for me, it's not like things stop there. The more I learn about theology, and contemplative theology is mystic theology. That's the same.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean it's about like the soul before God.
The soul before God. Could you give us like just an example of like a thought or a theory or a theology, like what that's from the contemplative theology that describes the soul before God, just so we can get a flavor of like how is it orienting us or disciplining us to receive better or something like that.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure if the question quite fits what it
Okay, could you just
is.
explain a little bit more what you mean, like the soul before God? That just sounds like a clue, and I just was wondering, like,
Right.
how does one communicate
Right.
the
I
soul
mean,
before
it's
God?
a if the soul, if like I am seeking God, the soul is seeking God. It's a question of like, well, how do I do that, and what posture do I do that in? And yeah, you kind of begin from the bottom up, and that's the practical advice that they're giving. Like, first is submitting to the reality that He has given you, like the reality of creation, the reality of the gift of yourself, of your life, the reality of the incarnation and revelation in Scripture, and submitting to those things. Uh, First, like approaching Him with your mind, approaching Him with your heart, approaching Him with your actions. Yeah, it's just about like how to seek God, and part of it comes from Him giving us directions, like through Scripture. Like we can figure out, I think, a good portion on our own, just because our hearts and minds are naturally oriented towards God, and He has revealed Himself in creation. Like, that's why I mean I think that there's so many very beautiful and profound writings in like pre-Christian societies, and it's not surprising to me that many of us are all like moving in the same direction, because that's what the human heart is aimed at. And then revelation steps in and things get a little bit more like specific, because if God is entering into the specifics of time and space, and revealing things that we couldn't attain to just from our own perspective looking
Yeah.
up. Yeah, I hope that helps. I'm forgetting what we were talking about just before that, though.
We were talking. There was another question because you brought up Jesus in front of power, and one of the through lines. One of the reasons I stumbled on you folks at New Polity. Well, I think it was the gender series, which is I still recommend everybody check out your gender series. You guys are coming up with a second season, hopefully.
Right.
Great,
Yeah.
excellent stuff. Was it you're basically kind of in this post-liberal dissident? You're kind of in this weird kind of zone of thinkers that I find there's a lot of energy going on in there. There's a lot of energy in the right now, and not
Yeah,
not the
so.
commercial right, but these little communities that you're a part of. And one of the perennial questions is when we talk about politics, it's like, well, what do we do with power and what do we do with authority? How do we dispense with authority? How do we create an order in order for us to be somewhat liberal, insofar as, I mean, classically liberal, free association. We rely on rational arguments to solve certain things. You know, we can deal with difference to a certain degree without calling each other heretics. I mean, those liberal values that were an outgrowth of the Christian order, like the powers that developed over time. I just wonder. I was just thinking about bringing that up. The inherent kind of contradiction of Christian nationalism is that Christ was not an authority, but he says that all the authority resides in him. But then when he's in front of authority, it's slippery. Like authority, like worldly authority, doesn't seem to. It seems to just like wash off of him completely. It's so weird to try to square that. Well, how do we design power structures or confront power or use power in a Christian way or derive authority over society in a way that is attuned with Christ, who was this all authority, no authority contradiction.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple things that I'd suggest for people looking to explore. I don't know if you looked at the Politics of Tyranny series that I think it's Mark Barnes and Andrew Willard Jones did. That was before the gender series. I thought that was incredible. I just think that Andrew's brilliant. And part of it is looking at principles of Catholic social teaching, which is really just, I guess, like biblical principles, but applied today.
Okay.
Specifically for like the social order. And it does engage that question, but part of the principles come just from looking at the example of Christ. So one of those, for example, would be that power is for the sake of those who are lower than you. There is a hierarchical structure to reality. Some people have more and some people have less. That's just a fact. It's not something that you can undo. And maybe it's money or wealth or power, position, but it also could just be talent.
Beauty, wit, intelligence,
those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So, so there is power, and so the postmoderns are right in seeing that there's these power structures that are out in the world, except they're only able to look at that cynically. So Jesus enters into this hierarchical world and reveals that power is for the sake of those who are below. Power is for the sake of service. And so when you're evaluating social structures, that's kind of your checkpoint. Another principle of Catholic social teaching is subsidiarity, which is you never usurp the vocation of the lower. So if the father's job is to provide food for his family, it would be wrong for the state to step in and take over his job unless there was something seriously wrong that was going on in the family. Because your job is not to take over people's vocations or calling, like what they're supposed to do in life.
Or their children, for that matter, right?
That too. But to enable them to do those things that they're being called to do. And I mean, you can see that again in the example of Jesus Christ. Like he is coming in a particular capacity, but he doesn't come as priest or king, and he's not trying to usurp those things either. And it's not as if, he is coming as priest and king, but he's not coming in all
every time you talk about Jesus, you have to say, well, he was this thing. Oh, but he wasn't this thing. He wasn't doing this thing, and he was doing this thing.
But he was. He is a paradox.
What's that say about God?
Oh, I think that makes perfect sense. God is paradox. What else could God be?
This is the Herod talking, I can tell. Kidding.
Yeah.
So he came to serve. Yeah. I'm just thinking we watch our organizations adopt a lot of these in word, but then you have to actually look at the deed of how they're actually serving. Like the welfare state is there to kind of nominally do what you're saying, but how does it actually work out in practice? How does it actually...
it ends up kind of usurping people's real authority. And I think that's part of the problem with Christian nationalism. Part of the critique from New Polity is just the state itself as a modern conception is already something that tries to usurp authority from the things that are below. So it used to be an easy example would be looking at France before and after the revolution. So before the revolution, it was more like a city-state setup, and there was a lot of diversity, lots of different dialects. There's lots of very different ways of being French, and you were French because you spoke French, but there's still a lot of differences and dialects and things like that. But you couldn't really have the same sort of Darwinian nationalist idea of what it meant to be a French person. In part because Darwin wasn't around. The idea of DNA wasn't there. But like national identity had a lot more to do with, I think, like language and common culture.
Yeah, locality and language. Yeah.
And again, it was pretty dispersed, and it gets confusing on the edges, on the margins, because it starts overlapping with other cultures and other languages. So there are just no like harsh lines, I guess. After the revolution, when Napoleon steps in, he basically centralizes all of these regions. Everyone is forced to speak Parisian French, and everyone is like brought into the same like Parisian culture. And it is extraordinarily efficient. People are able to communicate a lot easier. Things are able to move faster. But for what end? I mean, it ends up just being really expedient for the tyrant, for Napoleon to move people around quickly.
Yeah.
Whereas
and then it develops a chain reaction where all of Europe
yes.
eventually adopts that.
Right. So part of the Politics of Tyranny series is just looking at that situation, noting is that you can't actually exercise today's authoritarianism because you have all these barriers in place that keeps you from controlling people, because each city has its own rules and ways of life, and they're not centralized. Each city has its own dialect. There's different traditions. Like a lot of the laws just weren't written down in rule books. It was just the way things had always been done, and they're not the same from place to place. So the king's ability to just ubiquitously order something and have it like just repeat itself all the way down can really only happen effectively in a bureaucratic state. And so nationalism seems to be kind of a reaction to the atomization that happened with the Industrial Revolution and modern ideologies. And so they want to go, it seems to me that they want to return to tradition and return to having like the goods that they had before, which was like identity and like having a national like identity. Like you can see that's a good thing, but they're doing it through the apparatus of a state. So the way that the whole nation functions is totally different than what was before. So it's trying to return to tradition with like just a new system, and it doesn't work, and it ends up being authoritarianism. And so, yeah, I don't think that you can marry the modern state and the church. I think that they are incompatible.
Well, I guess the other, I guess, thought experiment from the post-liberal right is that, well, we have to keep the state from becoming the total state on its own because it wants to do that no matter what. So we have to actually resist the state in order for this conversion or people to adopt values that we think are better values than the values that the state has adopted and that it is now teaching and instilling in the young. So there is kind of a kind of a resistance, kind of rebellion kind of thing fomenting that's it's got to be done correctly. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. And
yeah, well,
you guys just have a bunch of guns at the new politics. You guys ready to go to bunker mode if
I'm not
the
supposed
feds
to talk
come?
about that.
Okay, or I'm sorry. I knew there was a line. I was going to cross it.
I think it involves like doing kind of like useless things or like things that slow things down. Because people are more easily controlled when you're a number, when you are isolated. And so like all the barriers that language and custom would have provided as protection against the tyrant, we want those back.
So this is this echoes a lot of this is continually one of the antidotes that is brought up, like get back to the land, grow some chickens, or raise some chickens, rear chickens, whatever you do with chickens. Go bowling, get back in real life, but just this subversive, non-compliant kind of thing, or this place where this act of living that expands or is bears witness to a fuller human existence.
Yeah, or maybe like bears witness to the fact that there's political authority and power outside of the state. If you consider politics in a broader sense, like politics as the use of power ordered towards the common good of a society of people living together. I have political power without actually being in a political office because of the influence that I have on society. And so I think the first thing is entering into that space, into that imagination, because if you think you don't have something, you can't exercise it as a power. And so I think recognizing that as the first step and then entering into those spaces, exercising that power, and then over time, I think through like time and custom, those spaces expand. And like, I don't think that this is I think this vision is a long-term vision. It's creating slightly more space for the next generation to move in. Because like, once things like really start to collapse, because I am cynical and I do think that's where things are heading. And I don't know when. It's going to be the places that already have like alternative like structures, I guess, that are going to be the ones that will survive the most. So I think that's kind of a better attitude to have. And I do think going back to Rome is kind of helpful for that. At some point, the empire did collapse, but there were alternative structures that were being built, and they weren't originally oriented towards that. So like the monasteries, like they were originally like simply houses for prayer. But then when the economic world just collapsed around them, they ended up being the source of stability for the people who lived around them. They ended up like teaching them like how to farm and like bringing these skills back to them, and creating like their own like kind of local economies, since all the trade had just collapsed. And they're the ones who preserved the intellectual traditions, but that wasn't their like original intention, so to speak. But they were entering into those structures and actually there were, I suppose,
being useful despite themselves.
Yeah.
So you guys are having a conference in Steubenville, Ohio. Is it okay if I reveal the location? I mean, I don't have the actual address, but it's in Steubenville, Ohio. That's next weekend, not this coming weekend. But I don't know when this will be recorded, but it's May 5th. Published, so yeah. And that's where all your energy is going into? Do you have, you're going to be giving a lecture, doing like some sort of like hula hoop jazz show or something like that?
You know, we were considering that, but we decided that it might be a little bit boring.
Oh,
weird.
Boring?
Okay. If Mark did anything, it would be exciting.
He's a pretty exciting guy.
Mark is just, he's too funny. Sometimes I just want to record our meetings. Because they're absurd. We're changing the format this year because it used to be just an academic conference. I think most of the energy goes into creating the journal. The academic journal comes out 4 times a year, and so if you're just plugged into YouTube, then maybe you don't know about it. But the format of that is kind of changing, and the conference too. So it's not just going to be academics reading academic papers, because a lot of people have found out about New Polity through the podcast, and then they show up to the conference and it's papers. So I realized, well, that doesn't work.
So you guys are going to have like cider and turkey or something? You're going to have a little bit more social aspect.
Bread and beer.
Bread and beer.
Bread. Yeah. Okay. So there's going to be 2 keynotes, and then the rest are going to be kind of more like podcast format conversations. So we're going to try this format. I think it'll be fun. And then see how that works for the following year.
Yeah. And are you working on anything like a paper yourself? Do you have something in the pike that's coming down the pike?
Um,
Like a
not for
memoir?
the
Yeah.
conference. Mark and I are doing the podcast format
Okay. Yeah.
conversation. We were going to be talking with Abigail Favali, who I think you've talked with before.
Yeah.
Uh,
I sent you guys her book. I'm like, you have to check out this woman.
oh
She's
yeah, it was
she's
great. It
at
was
Notre
fantastic.
Dame, right? I think.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually stopped by her office.
Oh,
She wasn't
really? You
there.
got to meet her?
No, she wasn't
Oh,
there.
she wasn't there. Sorry. Oh,
Yeah, I was trying to meet someone else, and then I decided to run around and see if I could catch her too. But she had a family event come up that she couldn't move, so
yeah.
she's no longer joining us, which is very disappointing because I was
Oh,
very excited to talk about her book.
oh. Well,
I thought it was
you
fantastic.
should Skype her and you absolutely just Zoom her in. You guys actually absolutely have to have her on. There's a lot of really awesome energy in the gender debate where from your position, from the Catholic position. If you guys can bring that in, it just would enrich your dialogue.
Oh yeah, I agree. So hopefully we can snag her at some point. It may not happen for the conference. Like logistics for that just isn't going to work out. I don't think because we're not
Oh, okay.
recording anything.
Oh, okay. For the conference itself, I thought you were talking about the next series on gender that you guys have planned. Do you know when that
No,
will
she
be
was going
coming
to
out?
come. Hmm?
Do you know when the gender part 2?
Um,
Gender trouble?
not for a couple, not for a
Months.
couple months.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Mark and I are going to start recording things after the conference, but then there's another series that's in the works that will go out first.
Great.
And then us.
And do you guys, does New Polity, do you guys like go like send missionaries to different colleges? Are you kind of just doing your own thing and publishing, or are you guys visiting and touring and stuff like that yet?
Uh, kind of. I mean, if people invite us for speaking engagements, then we'll accept those. But people are kept pretty busy in Steubenville. Like people are doing other things. Andrew's a professor at the local university, so that's his full-time job. So he can't do as much traveling, but he does get speaker invitations and things like that.
Cool. I have one more question, but I'm going to save it till after the recording is done.
Okay.
Maria, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time. And I didn't know what we were going to
Likewise.
talk about. We had some ideas. We talked about
Yep.
something else.
Yep.
Invariably.
As always.
It's the way of the
I
world.
tried to be prepared, but it's just next time I won't at all.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.